Well, I want to thank all of you for coming, braving the snow. Good job on that. And also thank especially Shatika Brown and also the Divinity School students and staff who've helped get this ready. So if you appreciated the breakfast, why don't we give them a hand of applause for that. So, let me start with the question that we're going to discuss. I'll make a few excuses as we go along that you've got a professor talking to you about these topics, so any chance for extended nuance will be brought in. So the question I posed for us, who are the Christians of Iraq and Syria? Before we actually get into answering the question, I want to sort of talk about what prompts this question and some different ways that we could answer it. I think probably, as you're quite well aware, the main reasoning that prompts this question are the current dynamics in the Middle East. Let's see, there's some pictures of the actual people, of actual Christians from, in this case, Baghdad. And here's a map that can sort of frame what we're talking about. There are three main dynamics that make this question particularly relevant to ask at this time. So the first of those dynamics, of course, is the 2003 American invasion of Iraq and the long aftermath of that. In Syria, it's the ongoing Syrian civil war, ongoing since 2011. And then, most particularly, this past summer, the capture of Mosul, Iraq's second largest city, and much of the Nineveh Plain, that refers to sort of this region here around Mosul, by the so-called Islamic State in the summer of 2014. Now, just a brief word on the Islamic State. I'm going to be preferring to use the, you probably noticed there are several confusing acronyms, ISIS, ISIL. I'm going to be using the Arabic acronym Daesh, which there are several different reasons for using that, which I'd be happy to go into in the Q&A. Probably the most important of those is that actually reminds us of the Arabic name that's being used by the state, by the so-called Islamic State, and also allows me to not call them the Islamic State, which is in itself an act of propaganda on their part. So these are the three main dynamics that make this question particularly salient. On the other hand, it's not just the Christians or even just the religious minorities, but all segments of the population of Syria and Iraq who've experienced incalculable violence over the last decade due to these events. So while my expertise and our topic today will have to do with just one subset of these countries' populations, the Christian population, I really want to make it clear from the outset that I'm not in any way trying to downplay the widespread humanitarian crisis being experienced by almost everyone in Syria and Iraq. But time and expertise are limited, and you're here to hear about one group. So who are the Christians of Iraq and Syria? Now, we could answer this question in several ways. We could try and think about political or demographic data. So again, taking you a bit more into the map, this is the Nineveh Plain around Mosul, where the center of much of the crisis for the past 7-8 months has been. Or if we were to put a political map, it would show you the realities on the ground. This area up here is controlled by the Kurdish portion of Iraq. This is controlled by the main government of Iraq. This is controlled by the government of Syria and various Syrian factions. And then this area here is the Daesh-controlled area in the middle. And so we could approach the question in terms of demographic and political data. We could also address the question in terms of the humanitarian needs of these populations. But I want to push us to think about it in a sort of deeper sense and to ask what's at stake for the rest of the world alongside these communities. That's mainly because I'm a historian and not a political scientist, so that's an excuse. Maybe if we could get our dean to fund a whole series of these breakfasts for you to come to, we could answer the question in extended detail. But as a historian, I want to talk about what's the historical identity of these threatened communities. What are the cultural achievements that are central to their own sense of identity? In other words, to talk about who they are not as refugees, which in their experience would not be how they would identify, but to look at their culture and their cultural heritage. And to ask then from our own perspective, what do they add to the richness of global diversity, and then even to our own context here in the West, and especially here in a divinity school. How are these people's parts of our own story? How can knowing them and their history help us to imagine our own story in a broader way and in solidarity with them? So that's the story I want to tell you in the next few minutes, both to let these communities, or at least a few of them, define themselves and let you hear them, how they would describe themselves, and also to persuade you that their current suffering is in some very real ways a loss that's a loss for all of us, and that the threat of their permanent eclipse carries with it a double tragedy that these communities may cease to exist at the very moment that we've begun to realize our debt to them. Now, having said that's the historical road we're going to take, we can talk a bit about population data. Before we do that, here, this is a good example of sort of the long cultural legacy. I don't know if you can make this out because it's built right into the side of the cliff. This is one of the largest monasteries in Iraq, the St. Matthew Monastery, about 20 kilometers north of Mosul. Monasteries are often built in very dramatic geographic settings like that. I will talk briefly about the numbers, and if you're interested in the numbers, I've posted to my Twitter account, which you can just get on the web and look at, some links to where you could get more information about that. But what are the numbers for these various Christian populations in Syria and Iraq? Well, Christians in Iraq, before 2003, we can estimate that Christians made up about 5% of the population of Iraq, or somewhere between 1 and 1.5 million. Today, we don't have accurate numbers, either for Iraq or for Syria, but we can estimate that at the most, they represent about 500,000. Probably it's more on the lower end of 200,000. So you can see we're looking at a dramatic collapse for these populations due to the instability in the country. For Syria, we don't have comparative data. At the beginning of the Syrian civil war, Christians represented about 10% of the Syrian population, or about 1.5 million. So roughly, if we were to go back to the early 2000s, we're looking at somewhere 2 to 3 million in population for both countries. Now, what is the current state of the refugee and IDP, or internally displaced persons? A lot of data has just been released because it's the beginning of a new calendar year. So this data that I'm going to refer to is mainly from the UN, some from the Department of State, and it's pretty staggering. So in Iraq, we have roughly 3.3 million internally displaced persons. So that's sort of internal refugees who haven't left the country but are not able to reside in their homes. And of those 3.3 million, 1.5 million of those left their homes since June with the beginning of the Daesh takeover of Mosul. The situation in Syria is even worse. Since 2011, the estimates are of more than 200,000 casualties in the Syrian civil war. And according to the U.S. Department of State, there are nearly 4 million Syrians who are refugees in neighboring countries. And then on top of that, an additional 7 million who are internally displaced within Syria itself. Just to give you a sense of how bad the situation in Syria is, northern Iraq actually hosts some 200,000 Syrian refugees for whom fleeing to northern Iraq is a better alternative than remaining in Syria. And just to gauge the sort of extent of the humanitarian crisis, which the UN High Commission on Refugees is describing as one of the severest that it's ever dealt with, there's estimated need of over $2 billion for Syria and $2 billion for Iraq just to address the current refugee and IDP crises. So these are really very much pressing needs. But let's talk about how specifically Christian populations have fared in the current crisis. Obviously, the refugee crisis is affecting the population as a whole. It's easier to answer this question about how the current crisis has affected religious minorities on a sort of particular basis rather than out of generalizations, because partly we just don't have the data. But it's pretty clear that Christian populations, Yazidis, other religious minorities have experienced particular violence arising from their status as religious minorities in the Daesh-controlled regions of both Syria and Iraq. They've been forced to flee or face enslavement, torture, or execution, resulting in pretty much nearly 100% population loss. There was a shocking report released just yesterday by the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child detailing some of the issues with child enslavement and even execution of children. This process, while coming to the world's attention in 2014, had actually already begun in 2013 when Daesh took over the city of Raqqa, a city of about 200,000 in Syria, where churches were closed and religious minorities were also given these stark choices of fleeing, facing enslavement, or death. And this situation has only been exacerbated then with the takeover of Mosul, which Mosul is both the ancient city of Nineveh, so if you hadn't heard of Mosul before now, you probably actually had heard of it, just didn't realize it. And Mosul is the second largest urban population in Iraq. So in terms of affecting the population, this is a significant trauma for the country as a whole. It also then had the second largest, as you might expect, second largest Christian population of any urban center in Iraq. And in addition, there were several smaller towns and villages, a few of whom were actually majority Christian, such as the town of Karakosh, which lie in the sort of larger Nineveh Plain region, which were also taken over by Daesh. These things obviously weigh incredibly heavily on both those who've experienced them and even those of us who are learning about them remotely. But I want to get us to sort of the deeper questions then of who are these Christian groups, how did they get there in the first place, and what is at stake beyond, of course, the sheer human suffering of the current crisis, which I certainly don't want to downplay. But I do want to push us beyond that, which I think the world is realizing, to also looking at what's lost when these communities cease to exist. To do that, I'm going to take us back through more than 2,000 years of Middle Eastern history. But let me comment on these images first. This actually just gives you a sense of what happened in Mosul. Immediately after the takeover, houses belonging to various religious minorities, Christians, Shia, were marked by the Islamic State, both with a symbol, in this case, this is the Arabic letter Nun for Nasrani or Nazarene, meaning Christian, and then this inscription here actually says property of the Islamic State, indicating that it's been confiscated. I found very little media reporting on who actually owned these properties. This was one case where I was able to find some reporting. I wasn't able to verify it, but it's the woman here on the Skype screen who, fittingly enough, given the cultural heritage we'll talk to in a moment, her name is Mary and her husband's name is Joseph, and was among those who fled Mosul and had their property confiscated. Besides acts against individuals, this is the former tomb and mosque of the prophet Jonah, which is one of the most significant shrines in Mosul since it's ancient Nineveh, and a site of shared religious devotion over the centuries for Jews, Christians, and Muslims together. Because it doesn't fit with the particular sectarian view of Islam held by Daesh, it was destroyed in a very dramatic fashion. All right, but now to take you back 2,000 years of history, and to do it in a way via Mosul. This is actually a manuscript of Isaac of Nineveh, one of the most prolific Syriac ancient Christian authors, lived in the 600s, and for a while was the Archbishop of Mosul, and is a good way for us to begin to think about, okay, who are these Christian populations and where did they come from? And that pushes us all the way back to thinking about the Fertile Crescent. Sorry if, being a professor, I can't but help give you a little history lesson. If you'll remember, the Fertile Crescent is roughly this shape here with the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and is the seat of thousands of years of ancient Near Eastern cultures. And one of the cultures that develops out of there is Aramaic culture. And Aramaic culture, of course, then also flourishes into several different cultures. It's used as an imperial language by various empires. It's used as a religious language in Judaism. Some small portions of the Hebrew Bible, such as the book of Daniel, have portions in Aramaic. And then it's used by early Christians. In fact, in a minute, I'll help you realize that you actually know a few words of Aramaic, and then by extension Syriac, which is a later dialect of Aramaic. Now, to tell this story, I do need to focus my remarks a little bit, unless, of course, you want to come back for a series of breakfasts, like I mentioned. At present in Syria and Iraq, there are a number of different Christian groups from a number of churches, Orthodox, Catholic, Protestants. They also are composed of a number of ethno-religious groups, Armenians, Kurds, Greeks, Arabs, in some cases Muslim converts. And each of these fascinating Christian communities really could get their own breakfast as a topic. But for the remainder of our time, I want to focus on what's sort of the shared, interrelated church and ethnic communities that have this common heritage going back to earlier periods in the Near East. And there's a variety of churches that developed out of that, and they identify by a number of different names. So the Chaldean Catholic Church, the Ancient Church of the East, the Maronite Catholic Church, the Syrian Catholic Church. There's actually another church also called the Church of the East, the Syrian Orthodox Church. So these names may be familiar, one or two of them may be familiar to you. In addition, these churches also have some shared or overlapping ethnic identities, but also varying, sometimes identifying as Arab, sometimes as Assyrian, sometimes as Aramean. But what they all share in common is the ancient Christian language of Syriac. And here's a manuscript in Syriac. So what is Syriac? Syriac is a dialect of Aramaic, so it would be different from, say, the Aramaic of the Hebrew Bible in the same way that our English today is different from the language of Shakespeare, or in the ways that French and Spanish descend from Latin. So it's a dialect of Aramaic. It's used widely from the 100s AD or CE onward, and until the rise of Islam, it's the main language used throughout the Middle East as a lingua franca, a common language used for trade, for religious conversation. If you were going to travel, say, from ancient Palestine to ancient Persia, and you knew Syriac, you could probably make your way along pretty well. And it's deeply embedded in early Christianity. New Testament Christianity, like Judaism of the period, was Aramaic speaking, which again is not Syriac but closely related. Just to give you an example, you're probably familiar with the phrase Maranatha. How many of you have ever heard this phrase? This is actually a Syriac sentence or Aramaic sentence, Maran Etha, our Lord come. And this phrase would actually even work in some modern Syriac dialects. It would be exactly the same today. And many times in the Gospels, when you see examples of direct speech preserved, it's preserved with the Aramaic wording. So the words of dereliction on the cross, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, or Talitha Kumi, when the young girl is raised. And so this is the milieu of early Christianity, and there are certain branches of Christianity which then keep this Aramaic cultural milieu. You're probably more familiar with how Christianity spreads into the Roman Empire, where it then begins using Greek and Latin, eventually leading to the traditions of the Roman Catholic Church, the various Greek and other Orthodox churches. What you're probably less familiar with is how it spreads eastward. So here on this map, I've made out sort of a color code. This is roughly the Latin-speaking world that becomes the Roman Catholic world. This is roughly the Greek-speaking world that becomes the Greek Orthodox world. This is roughly the Coptic and Ethiopian world. And then these two blue and green areas are where Syriac Christianity spreads. And even though you may not be that familiar with it, and in the West we're just regaining our knowledge of it, actually probably until the year 1000, you could even argue until about the year 1200, it's these areas in blue and green that are actually the most dynamic, flourishing, even the largest, where the largest populations of Christians are. Certainly in the year 1000, most of Europe is still highly rural, very few urban settlements, and it's really in these areas where Christianity is spreading, and as you can see, spreading as far as what would today be Mongolia or the southern tip of India. And in fact, we have lots of evidence of this. Just to go back briefly to this Bible manuscript, this is actually the earliest Bible manuscript where the scribe took the courtesy of writing the date of the composition of the manuscript on it for us. It's not the earliest surviving Bible manuscript. There are earlier scraps and fragments, but this is the earliest one when the scribe went to the trouble of saying, oh yeah, and in this year I wrote this manuscript. It's in the 400s. And in fact, a good deal of early Bible manuscripts and in general early resources for the study of Christianity survive in Syriac. And you can kind of then imagine that Syriac spreads in two directions, Syriac Christianity that is. If you wanted to draw a line roughly from right here in the Black Sea down to the Red Sea here, you can kind of imagine two different cultures, and we call them the East Syrian one and the West Syrian one, not the most creative, but two different dialects of Syriac form, and eventually two different branches of Christianity form. Now, the reason for this is largely that this line, kind of right here or right here, is also the border of the Roman Empire. So the West Syrian Christian tradition forms inside the Roman Empire, and the East Syrian Christian tradition forms outside of the Roman Empire. And this is interesting for a variety of reasons, and I want to show you some examples of that. It means that Syriac Christianity often takes a different path from the history that we've seen or come to know from Western Christianity. This is actually a great example of this. You can recognize this, of course, as a depiction of the crucifixion. It's actually the earliest depiction of the crucifixion in a manuscript. It's from a Syriac manuscript, not surprisingly. Later it ended up in Italy, where they decided that the characters there looked too Middle Eastern, and so they touched the manuscript up to make them look more European. And this is a good example of sort of some of the stark differences between these traditions. This is one of my favorite West Syrian churches. This is the Monastery of St. Tekla. It's in modern-day Syria. It's actually in one of the 3 villages in Syria that still preserves a very early dialect of Aramaic that may be similar to the Western dialect used in the time of the New Testament. It's also seen considerable violence in the current situation. So let's talk briefly then about some of the riches of the Syriac tradition. And to do that, instead of just my words, I want to give you some words from within the tradition. There's one major author, Ephraim the Syrian, who writes in the 300s, whose legacy is shared by almost all I think actually all of the different churches and traditions, regardless of whether they're Catholic, Orthodox, East, West, whatever. And he really exemplifies, in a way, a lot of the unique and beautiful aspects. In particular, the use of verse for doing theology. Do we have any preachers here or wannabe preachers here today? Maybe they're not going to admit who they are. Bishop Pennell, raise your hand. So, not to put any pressure on you, but in the Syriac tradition, all preaching is done in metered verse. So if you can't write poetry, you can't preach a sermon. This has some beautiful effects on what gets said and can't be said in a sermon as well. It doesn't keep the sermons any shorter, but it does keep them constrained to a certain meter. And that means that then even within the Syriac Christian tradition, there's a real embrace of poetic thought. But rather than me talking about it, let me just read you. This is from Ephraim the Syrian's Hymns on Paradise, and this is the opening hymn in which he describes taking up the book of Genesis and reading about paradise. Now, in the Syriac tradition, they have our word paradise, or rather, I should say, we have their word paradise. The Persian word faradiso is where we get our word paradise from, and it means garden. So in the Syriac tradition, there's a very clear link between the Garden of Eden, paradise at the beginning, and paradise, the paradise at the end after the salvation of humanity. And so Ephraim is reading the account of the Garden of Eden and using it to reflect on what the ultimate paradise through God's salvation will be like. I read the opening of this book and was filled with joy, for its verses and lines spread out their arms to welcome me. The first rushed out and kissed me and led me on to its companion. And when I reached that verse wherein is written the story of paradise, it lifted me up and transported me from the bosom of the book to the very bosom of paradise. The eye and the mind traveled over the lines, as over a bridge, and entered together the story of paradise. The eye, as it read, transported the mind, and in return the mind too gave the eye rest from its reading. For when the book had been read, the eye had rest, but the mind was engaged. Both the bridge and the gate of paradise did I find in that book. I crossed over and entered, and my eye indeed remained outside, but my mind entered within paradise. I began to wander among things not described. This is the serene height, clear, lofty, and fair. Scripture named it Eden, the summit of all blessings. Let me skip a little bit ahead to what he experiences there. I gave praise as far as I was able, and was on the point of departing, when from the midst of paradise there came a sudden thunderous sound, and like the blare of trumpets in some camp, voices crying holy thrice over. Thus I knew that the divinity received praise in paradise. I had supposed paradise was empty, but I learned otherwise from the thunderous sound. Paradise delighted me as much by its peacefulness as by its beauty. In it there resides a beauty that has no spot. In it exists a peacefulness that knows no fear. How blessed is that person accounted worthy to receive it, if not by right, yet at least by grace, if not because of labors, yet at least through mercy. The poem continues on longer than that, but you'll have to read it for yourself. I hope that gives you, better than I could just by describing it, a sort of sense of the depth of these traditions. The fact that their theology is done mainly in poetic form allows them to address questions in ways quite different from Western traditions, and often with a lot of really interesting forms of creativity. There's an ancient Near Eastern genre form called the dialogue poem, in which two ideas, concepts, persons, characters debate about a topic. And two of my favorite of these in the Syriac tradition is one, a debate between death and sin as to who's more powerful. And sin says, well, look, I can make human beings do whatever I want. And death says, yeah, but I can stop them from doing anything. At which point, salvation appears to sort of spoil the fun of their argument, and describes how it's able to defeat both. There's another fascinating one. A lot of Syriac tradition is taken up with trying to imagine the gaps or spaces in the biblical text, right? So what was mentioned but not fully described. For example, if you notice, the Apostle Thomas in the Gospels is referred to as the twin. And actually, the name Thomas is actually the Syriac Aramaic word for twin. How many of you actually ever wondered whose twin was Thomas? Oh, good, one person. In the Syriac tradition, there's actually a whole extended reflection on this. It turns out that he's Jesus' twin, and this has to do with his imitation of Christ, and fuels a whole really long narrative that a few of my students have been subjected to read. Or there's one that imagines the thief on the cross, the one who said, by Christ, today you'll be with me in paradise. They imagine that the thief gets to paradise before Christ actually has returned from descending into Sheol. And the angel with the flaming sword guarding the gates of Eden says, whoa, hold on, you can't come in here. Didn't you know human beings have been kicked out of here? And there's a long extended discourse in which the angel has to be told, no, actually things have changed. Christ has died, Christ has risen. It recounts all of the salvation story. So that's to give you a little bit of a sense of the riches of these communities, and particularly this poetic aspect is preserved, especially the work of Ephraim the Syrian is core in many ways to the identity of these communities today. Another aspect that's sort of a core part of their identity is the fact that especially the East Syriac tradition was really the powerhouse of Christian missions and the spread of early Christianity. So, for example, you might not have realized that already by the 600s AD, Syriac missionaries had arrived in China, and we actually have monuments of this. And most likely by the 1st century AD already, Syriac Christianity was taking hold in South India. The branches in China eventually faded. The Syriac Christian traditions in India live on to the present and flourish today, where there are some 9 million Christians who identify as part of the Syriac tradition there. They're often referred to as the St. Thomas Christians. And this comes with some fascinating intercultural dynamics. So this is a traditional East Syrian cross. You can see here's the Holy Spirit descending in the same way that it descends in the baptism narrative of Christ. What you might not make out is the cross is resting on a lotus blossom here at the bottom. So fusing aspects of variety of Asian religion traditions into dialogue with Christianity. In fact, this is a manuscript. It's depicting the conversion of the Roman Emperor Constantine, but you can see that the artist, what the artist has as hand, as an object, is either the Mongolian or the Chinese emperor. So that's who served as a model for depicting the Christian Emperor Constantine. And indeed, here's this monument from the 600s in China. It's primarily in Chinese, but then along the edges it lists the names of the monks in Syriac characters. Oh, and this is even good. I can't help myself. In fact, the Mongolian alphabet itself is derived from the Syriac script. And is part of the spread of literacy through Syriac Christianity. All right, as you can tell, I could obviously go on about this, but I want to leave some time for questions. So let me just sort of wrap up by talking briefly about where these churches are in the present. This is a monastery likely abandoned now near Mosul, the Monastery of Elijah. This is actually the most recent Syrian Orthodox patriarch. The patriarch died in the middle of the Syrian conflict of natural causes, and the previous Syrian Orthodox Archbishop of New Jersey was actually selected as the new patriarch, and so traveled to Damascus. This is part of his reception by another head of one of the other churches in Syria at that time. And then these are just a few news file photos that I've pulled of churches in Iraq. I like this one because it also brings home for you a little bit of the generational diversity in the populations. So what's at stake for these communities? Well, there's several things. Of course, the humanitarian crisis threatens them as it threatens many minorities and even general populations in the region. But the particular emphasis of Daesh on a strict Islamification and an Islamification that actually involves the destruction of cultural heritage. There's actually a report earlier this week that Daesh is also going through the university library in Mosul and culling all non-Islamic books. There's been reports of the destruction of manuscripts, lots of reports of destruction of Islamic, Christian, Yazidi, other holy sites. So what can be done in response? Well, there are a variety of responses that I, at least personally, have found helpful that I'll leave you with. To take a note from the Syriac traditions themselves, most important is if you belong to a tradition that prays, to pray. John the Solitary, a Syriac author from the early Middle Ages, wrote, "Let us rejoice and give thanks to God that we've been held worthy, even for one small moment, to escape from talk and chatter, even though we may be occupied with a struggle. For we are able, albeit for just one moment, to be in divine conversation. Certainly this would be a note taken from within the Syriac cultures themselves. In the words of Pope Francis, prayer and action are also in order, primarily solving the humanitarian crisis. There are a number of groups involved in this. I'd be happy to chat more individually about that. Solving the military crisis. Here I'm not a political scientist and have will offer no solutions. But then lastly, something that we can do in the face of cultural genocide is to preserve those cultures in our own memory. And that's something that you can do in a variety of ways. Familiarize yourself with the heritage of these Syriac traditions. My students and I have set up a little table of recommended reading over there. Some of you have, even members of the community, have braved auditing classes here. Several students are involved in a digital project to archive and preserve Syriac Christianity. These are all responses that just through one community knowing another community, in my mind, is a powerful response to the cultural genocide crisis we face. All right, let me stop there and I'll welcome your questions. Yes?
The third Christian group after you went to Zaki or something, I don't know that one. There was a third Christian group that you mentioned.
Well, let's see. There's a lot of them. In 2003, we estimated there were about 20 different Christian denominations or churches. So the main ones are East and West. So the Church of the East is the Eastern one, and then there's a Catholic branch of that called the Chaldean Church. And then in the West, you have the Syrian Orthodox Church and the Syrian Catholic Church. Sometimes you'll hear the words Assyrian used instead of Syrian, and sometimes you'll hear the words Aramaean used. But those are more ethnic labels that particular ethnic groups like to use. There's also the Maronite Church, based primarily in Lebanon, is another Syriac heritage church.
So in the numbers that you talked about as far as refugees both within Iraq and Syria and the ones who have fled to bordering countries, does that also include people who have immigrated like into the United States in recent years?
I think that those numbers for Iraq, as far as I understand, are actually kind of a reset from since about 2008. So that actually doesn't include refugees from 2005 till 2008 or 2010. And we do know that in that period, the minority populations, especially Christian populations, were more heavily hit, at least in the first waves of refugees actually leaving Iraq. At some points, Christians made up 40% of those refugee waves, even though they only made up 5% of the population. And in the case of Jews, I believe at the present that there are, if there are any Jews, it's less than you could count on one hand. And they also, yeah, I think that's now the case.
Do you have a sense of whether, I'll use ISIS, whether ISIS is targeting other religious groups with varying degrees of focus? Are they uniformly against all that is not done, or do they have a pecking order of persecution?
Well, I'll use the excuse that I'm not a political scientist, I'm an ancient historian, so this is just my, sort of observations from reading media reports, so no inside information. It does seem that some groups, I think that the attention we've seen with the Yazidis, some groups are even more vulnerable because they don't have any sort of natural allies elsewhere. So the pressure put on them seems to have been more extreme. But it also seems to be the case that, Daesh is partly a sort of uncontrolled popular movement. It's not entirely clear how efficient of an organization with a well thought out ideology it is as opposed to a sort of mass movement of mass violence. So it's I'll just give you a phonetic pronunciation, D-A-E-S-H. It's taking the first letters of their name in Arabic, And there's a variety of reasons for doing this. One of them is that it avoids calling them the Islamic State in English. It's also the case that in Arabic, Daesh sounds partly like the word to trample, which is a slur. And so they've expressed their sentiment that they don't want to be called Daesh, so it's a small act of resistance, not calling them the Islamic State. It's also what all of my Arabic-speaking acquaintances refer to it as. So I think that helps us to see the conflict in its cultural context and not read the conflict as if it's primarily about us, which I think would be a mistake.
Do you know if any of these Christian denominations are connected to, say, the World Council of Churches or any kind of bodies that are global?
Mm-hmm. So certainly the Catholic denominations, which in Iraq the largest Christian group in Iraq is the Chaldean Catholic Church. So it's obviously connected. The Syrian Catholic Church is a much smaller church, but it would also be connected. I believe that the Church of the East and the Syrian Orthodox Church are also members. The Church of England has long had a very successful humanitarian assistance program in the Middle East, so it also has been heavily involved. But all across, there are groups doing good work all across the spectrum, from sort of mainline to historical Orthodox churches to evangelical organizations. It does seem to be getting some traction, though the United Nations reports that it's received, I think, less than 50% of, I mentioned those figures of more than 2 billion, less than 50% of that has been received. So the humanitarian need is still huge. And in the case of Iraq, actually, I think about 1 billion has been received, but 500 million of that was contributed by Saudi Arabia, one donor. So, world participation, I believe the U.S. has contributed 40 million or something like that. So, world participation is very low.
It's been I won't go back to too ancient history, but like the last 100 years, how did the collapse of the Ottoman Empire impact these communities, and the Anglicization or colonialization impacted it grow, the church to shrink it, etc.?
Yeah, so in many ways, the last 100 years have been involved considerable tragedy, especially for the populations in Iraq. So with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, there are extensive massacres of populations in the Ottoman Empire. We are more familiar with the Armenian case, but that's also the case for the Syriac populations. Then they received some relief in the British Mandate in Iraq, but they're used by the British as the colonial police force. And then when the British leave, there are additional massacres against the Christian populations in Iraq then. So the history of Western support for these groups is not a positive one.
What is the reason that Daesh is not used by, say, the media politically, that it sounds better to make it an Islamic State a little more against?
No, I think it's just confused. Their name has also changed 3 times in the last 12 months. So you'll hear ISIL, ISIS, Islamic State. I believe that this U.S. Department of State's current policy is ISIL, but I know John Kerry used Daesh extensively in recent remarks.
You mentioned the spread of Syriac Christianity to Eastern China. Was Nestorian Christianity a part of the Syriac tradition?
Yeah, so that actually is an older term for the Church of the East. The term Nestorian, I should have clarified this. You might be familiar with the term Nestorian, or also the terms Jacobite or Monophysite. And those are 3 older terms used for Syriac traditions. Today, they're not used because those terms were actually coined by Western Christians who viewed these groups as heretical. So those terms were never used by those churches themselves. What they would call themselves are Orthodox or Church of the East as their own identity. But yes, that's exactly the same groups. There's a pretty good book that sort of surveys that long history by Philip Jenkins. It's over on the table over there. I don't agree with all of the conclusions of the book, but I guess that's my job as a professor. But would give a good survey of that.
Just one comment in that when the exodus of Jews from Iraq and Syria began to occur after 48, there was a new nation, a Jewish nation that was ready to absorb them. The tragedy of the Christians is that the Christian world is not ready to absorb such numbers anyway, so they are stuck. You don't have any Christian nation that says we're taking anyone in. And as a result, the misery is unbelievable. It will continue to be so until there will be no Christian left except Lebanon.
Thank you. Well, if there are no further questions, I want to thank you for coming and listening to this topic that's very important to me. And I'd be more than happy to chat individually with any of you afterward.
The Syriac art.
Well, so it's just called the Fertile Crescent in general, and it would follow the same. So this is the Tigris and Euphrates River, and this is all fertile land, and then this is Palestine, which is fertile land. This is all desert here. So this sort of arc or crescent shape.